They laughed when the widow touched the man no one else would, and by nightfall, that laughter would cost them their certainty. Red Hollow had a way of shrinking people down to what they could no longer do. And Elias Boone had not stood on his own 2 feet in near 5 years, not since the accident folks spoke about in low voices and quick glances. He lay half-turned in the dust outside the general store, boots worn thin, hat tipped low to hide the kind of eyes that had stopped expecting anything from anyone. A few men leaned on the rail, smirking, passing judgment like it was cheap whiskey. And right there in the middle of it all, Clara Whitmore stepped forward, her black dress catching the dry wind, her hands steady despite the stares. A widow in a town that treated silence like guilt. She didn't ask permission, didn't look around for approval. She simply knelt, the wood planks creaking beneath her knees as she reached for Elias, brushing dirt from his sleeve with a care no one had shown him in years. Someone chuckled, low and sharp. "You fixing broken things now, Clara?" Another voice followed. "Careful, he might drag you down with him." But Clara said nothing, not a word. Her fingers moved slow, deliberate, as if every motion carried weight the others couldn't see. The sun sat high, pressing heat into the backs of every neck, the smell of leather and dust thick in the air, and still she stayed there, one hand steady on his shoulder, the other adjusting the worn fabric at his side. Elias shifted slightly, more from surprise than strength, his voice rough as gravel when it came. "You don't have to do this." But she shook her head once, barely, eyes focused not on his weakness, but on something deeper, something no one else had bothered to look for. "I know," she said quietly. And that was all. No speech, no explanation, just that. And somehow it settled heavier than anything the crowd had thrown her way. A breeze rolled through the street, carrying dust. Between boots and wagon wheels, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Then silence crept in, thin at first, then stretching wider, because there was something in the way she didn't rush, didn't hesitate, like she was working toward a result no one else could imagine. And when she finally rose, offering her arm without asking, the laughter came again, louder this time, covering the unease they didn't want to name. But Elias looked at her hand like it was something he hadn't seen in years, not pity, not obligation, something else, something that made him hesitate longer than he should have. And somewhere beyond the buildings, past the dry hills, the wind shifted direction, slow, deliberate, like the land itself was holding its breath for what would come next. Clara did not wait for him to decide. She shifted her weight and lifted his arm across her shoulders with a quiet strength that did not match her frame. And for a moment Elias resisted, not because he could not move, but because he had forgotten what it meant to be moved with purpose. The crowd leaned in slightly, boots scraping against dry boards. Someone muttered that it would end the same as always. Another whispered that she would give up halfway down the street. But Clara adjusted her stance, firm, patient, and began to walk, one step at a time across the uneven dirt. The distance to her cabin sat just under half a mile beyond the last fence post, a path most would not notice. Yet she followed it like she had already walked it 100 times in her mind. Elias felt the shift in balance, the slow drag of his own boots trailing, the rhythm of her breathing steady and controlled, not rushed, not strained, just constant. As if she had decided something long before this moment and was now simply fulfilling it. "You are wasting your strength," he said under his breath, his voice quieter now, less certain. But Clara did not answer. Not immediately. She focused on the ground ahead, on the small dips and stones that could turn a step into failure. The wind pressed against them from the west, carrying the dry scent of sage and sun-baked wood. And still she moved forward. The laughter from the town faded behind them, replaced by a silence that felt heavier, like something unfinished trailing in their wake. By the time they reached the broken gate near her property line, Elias noticed something else. She had not stumbled once, not even when the path narrowed or when his weight shifted unevenly. She corrected each movement before it became a problem, as if she understood the burden she carried better than he did himself. The cabin came into view, weathered boards, a single window, a roof that had seen more seasons than repairs, yet the door stood straight, recently reinforced, the hinges oiled, small details that spoke of preparation. Clara paused only once to push the door open with her foot, guiding him inside, where the air cooled slightly, shaded from the harsh sun. And for the first time since the street, She lowered him carefully into a chair positioned near the center of the room, not by accident, not by convenience, but placed with intent. Elias exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that felt unfamiliar. His eyes moved across the room, noticing things he had not expected: a table cleared of clutter, strips of cloth folded neatly, a basin filled with clean water, and near the far wall, something else: metal pieces arranged in a way that did not belong to a simple widow's home. Thin rods, hinges, and straps laid out with precision. Catching faint light from the window, he frowned slightly, confusion settling in where resignation had once lived. "What is all this?" he asked, not accusing, just unsure. Clara closed the door behind them, the latch clicking softly into place, shutting out the world that had already decided his story. She stood there for a second, her hand resting against the wood, as if listening to the quiet on the other side. Then she turned back to him, her expression unchanged, steady, grounded. "Something they stopped believing in," she said, stepping toward the table, her fingers brushing lightly over the metal as if greeting an old promise. And outside, beyond the thin walls, the wind shifted again, slower now, circling the small cabin like it was waiting for something to begin. Clara moved with a calm that did not belong to this town, her hands steady as she lifted one of the metal braces from the table, the hinges catching the light in thin silver lines. Elias watched without speaking, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to place a memory that refused to surface. The room carried a quiet tension, not fear, not doubt, something closer to anticipation, like a storm that had not yet decided whether it would break. Clara knelt in front of him, not as someone lowering herself, but as someone aligning the world to eye level. "I am going to ask you to trust me," she said, her voice even, without urgency, without promise. Elias let out a slow breath, the kind that carried years behind it. "People have asked me that before," he replied, but there was no bitterness left in it, only habit. Clara nodded once, accepting the weight of that truth without trying to soften it. Then she reached for his boot, not to remove it, but to adjust its position, turning his foot slightly outward, measuring something invisible. Her fingers traced along the edge of his leg, not searching for pain, but for alignment, for structure, for something that could still respond. Outside, a loose shutter tapped softly against the cabin wall, a slow rhythm that echoed the passing of time. Inside, Clara worked in silence, fastening the first brace along his lower leg. The leather straps pulled firm but not tight, the metal frame settling into place with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have. Elias flinched, not from discomfort, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being positioned, of being prepared. His hands gripped the edge of the chair, knuckles pale against the worn wood. "What if it does not work?" he asked, the question barely above a whisper. Clara did not look up immediately. She secured the second strap, then adjusted the hinge at his knee with careful precision. "Then we will know we tried something they never did," she answered, simple, direct, without apology. The words settled between them, heavier than doubt, lighter than hope, just enough to hold on to. She moved to the other leg, repeating the process, each motion deliberate, practiced, as if she had done this many times in a place where no one had been watching. Elias noticed the small details now, the slight wear on the leather, the polished edges of the metal where hands had adjusted them again and again. This was not something new, not something made on a whim. This was something built over time, quietly, patiently, without an audience. His breathing changed, slower now, deeper, as if his body was remembering a rhythm it had long abandoned. Clara stepped back once both braces were secured, her eyes scanning him, not for weakness, but for balance, for possibility. "We are not going to rush," she said, her tone grounding the moment. "But we are not going to stay where they left you either." Elias swallowed, his gaze drifting to the floor, then back to her, the silence stretching just long enough to matter. Then he nodded, small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and Clara saw it. She moved to his side, one hand ready at his arm, the other hovering near the brace, not to control, but to guide. Outside, the wind circled again, slower, closer, brushing against the cabin walls like it was listening. And inside, for the first time in years, Elias Boone shifted his weight forward, not because he had to, but because Something inside him had begun to believe he could. The first attempt did not look like progress. It looked like hesitation given form. Elias leaned forward, his hands pressing into the arms of the chair as if the wood itself might give him strength. The braces held his legs in place, rigid, unfamiliar, like borrowed pieces of someone else's body. Clara stayed close, not touching yet, just present, her eyes fixed not on what he could not do, but on the smallest shift in balance. "Do not think about standing," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise in his head. "Just think about moving forward." Elias exhaled slowly, the air catching in his chest before releasing. His shoulders tightened, then loosened again. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air thicker, every sound sharper, the faint creak of the floor beneath him, the soft rattle of metal at his knees, the distant wind brushing against the cabin like a quiet witness. He pushed down harder, arms straining, his body rising just an inch, then settling back again. Not failure, just not yet. Outside, a pair of boots stopped near the fence. Someone had wandered close enough to notice the open window. A shadow passed briefly across the light, then lingered, curiosity always stronger than kindness in Red Hollow. Inside, Clara adjusted her stance, one foot slightly behind the other, ready but not interfering. "Again," she said, not louder, just certain. Elias closed his eyes for a second, not in defeat, but in focus, as if he was searching for something buried deep beneath years of stillness. When he tried again, it came slower, more controlled, his weight shifting forward, the braces catching the movement, holding it, guiding it into something structured, something real. His boots pressed into the floor, not dragging this time, but anchoring. His arms trembled, but they held. The chair creaked as it gave up its hold on him inch by inch. Clara stepped closer now, one hand lightly touching his forearm, not lifting, just reminding him that he was not alone in the motion. "That is it," she said, almost a whisper, but it carried more weight than the laughter from earlier ever had. Elias felt it then, not strength, not fully, but resistance, something pushing back against gravity instead of surrendering to it. His knees locked for a fraction of a second, the metal holding firm, and in that brief moment, something changed, not in his body, but in his belief. He opened his eyes, looking not at the floor, but straight ahead, and for the first time in years, his posture shifted from someone being carried by the world to someone standing against it. Outside, the figure by the fence leaned closer, the silence drawing attention instead of dismissing it. Another set of footsteps approached, slower, cautious, the kind that came when people sensed something they could not explain. Inside the cabin, Elias rose higher, not fully upright, not yet, but no longer seated, suspended in a space between what he had been and what he might become. Clara did not smile, did not celebrate. She simply stayed steady beside him, her presence as constant as the ground beneath his feet. And in that fragile, unspoken moment, the town that had already decided his ending began. Without knowing it, to lose control of the story. He was not supposed to be there, not in that space between sitting and standing, not with the weight of his own body pressing down through legs that had forgotten their purpose. But Elias held it, trembling, uncertain, real. Clara did not move to catch him, did not rush to steady him. She understood something the others never had, that if she held him now, the moment would belong to her instead of him. So she stayed just close enough for him to feel, but far enough for him to choose. "Do not look down," she said softly, her voice cutting through the instinct that pulled his eyes toward the floor. "Look forward." And he did, slowly, his gaze lifting past the worn boards, past the edge of the table, to the door that stood closed but no longer distant. The idea of reaching it settled in his mind, not as a goal, but as a direction. Outside, the shadows had multiplied. 2 men now, then 3, drawn by the quiet instead of noise, their voices low, uncertain, the kind of whisper that follows something people do not yet understand. Inside, Elias shifted again, this time, not just holding himself up, but leaning forward with intent. The braces responded with a faint metallic whisper, the hinges aligning, supporting, guiding. His right foot pressed harder into the floor, not dragging, not sliding, pressing, and for a second that stretched longer than it should have. It held. Clara saw it before he did. The change in pressure, the way his balance adjusted without collapsing. "That is yours," she said. Not praising, not surprised, just stating a fact he had never been allowed to claim. Elias swallowed, his throat tight, his breath uneven. But something steadier was building beneath it, something that did not ask permission from the past. He shifted his weight again, carefully, deliberately, and this time, his left foot responded, not fully, not clean, but enough to move, enough to change everything. The chair behind him stood empty now, no longer holding him in place, no longer defining him. The space between him and the door shortened by inches. But those inches carried years inside them. Outside, one of the men leaned closer to the window, his hand resting against the frame, his expression no longer amused, no longer certain, just watching. The others followed, drawn in by something they could not name. Inside, Elias took another movement, not quite a step, but no longer still. The floor creaked beneath the pressure, the braces held firm, and his body, uncertain as it was, did not fall back into what it had been. Clara remained silent now, her presence steady, letting the moment belong entirely to him. And as the distance to the door continued to close, slow and fragile, the truth began to form not in words, not in explanation, but in the quiet realization that what they had all accepted as permanent had never truly been tested until now. The distance to the door was no longer just space. It had become a question, and Elias felt it pressing against him with every shallow breath he took. His legs trembled under the weight, not from weakness alone, but from the shock of being asked to remember something they had long forgotten. Clara shifted slightly to his side, not touching, just present, her shadow falling beside his. On the wooden floor, steady, unshaken. "One more," she said quietly, not urging, not demanding, simply placing the next moment within reach. Elias focused ahead, the grain of the door, the faint line where sunlight slipped through the frame, small details that anchored him to something real, something forward. Outside, the men at the window had stopped whispering, their silence heavier now, eyes fixed on the shape moving inside. One of them stepped closer, boots pressing into the dirt, drawn by something he could not explain. Inside, Elias shifted his weight again, slower this time, more deliberate, his right foot pressed down, held, then his left followed, not perfectly, not clean, but enough to move him forward another inch. The braces whispered softly, metal against motion, a sound that did not belong to failure. Clara watched the alignment, the angle of his knees, the balance in his shoulders. She adjusted nothing, corrected nothing, because this was no longer something she could give him. This was something he had to claim. His hands hovered slightly away from the chair now, no longer clinging to it, no longer needing it. And in that small separation, something larger broke loose. The past loosening its grip without ceremony, without warning. Elias felt it before he understood it. The moment his body stopped asking permission from what had been and started answering to what could be. His next movement came with less hesitation, not stronger, but clearer, as if the path ahead had finally revealed itself. The door was closer now, not distant, not unreachable, just there, waiting, outside. Another figure joined the others, then another, the quiet drawing them in like a signal no one had sent. Their faces no longer amused, no longer dismissive, just still, watching something they could not dismiss anymore. Inside, Elias took another step, this time unmistakable, heel touching down, weight settling, body holding. The room seemed to pause around him. Even the wind outside softened, as if the world itself had slowed to witness what it had once refused to believe. Clara allowed herself a breath then, small, controlled, not relief, not surprise, just acknowledgement. And Elias, standing there between what he had been and what he was becoming, realized something no one had told him, something no one in that town had ever understood, that the line between impossible and forgotten was thinner than it looked, and sometimes, all it took was one person who refused to step away. The next step did not come from strength. It came from something quieter, something that had been buried beneath years of being told to stop trying. Elias stood there, balanced in a way that still felt fragile, but no longer accidental. His breathing slowed, not because the effort was gone, but because the fear had shifted. It was no longer fear of falling, it was fear of stopping. Clara noticed it in the way his shoulders steadied, The way his eyes no longer searched for escape, but for direction. She did not speak this time, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment no longer needed words. Outside, the small group at the window had grown. 5 now, maybe. More behind them, their presence pressing against the cabin like a question waiting to be answered. But inside, the answer was already forming. Elias moved again, not with hesitation, but with intention. His right foot lifted slightly, just enough to clear the floor, the brace guiding the motion, holding it true, and when it came down, it did not collapse. It held, solid, undeniable, a step, real and complete. The sound of it, soft against the wood, carried farther than it should have, reaching the ears outside, silencing even the faintest whisper. Clara's hand hovered near his arm, but still did not touch. She understood now that every step he took without her was worth more than any support she could offer. Elias felt the shift ripple through him, not just in his legs, but in his chest, in the way his breath filled deeper, steadier, like something inside him had opened that had been closed for too long. He took another step, slower, more controlled, each movement building on the last, not perfect, not smooth, but certain. The door stood just ahead now, no longer a distant idea, but a destination within reach. Outside, one of the men stepped back slightly, as if the sight itself demanded space. Another removed his hat without realizing it. Their expressions no longer guarded, no longer skeptical, just still, witnessing something they could not deny. Inside, Elias reached the door, his hand rising slowly, not out of habit, but out of purpose. His fingers brushed against the wood, rough beneath his skin, grounding him in the reality of where he stood. Clara watched him then, not as someone helping, but as someone witnessing, her eyes steady, her presence quiet. Elias paused for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from understanding, the weight of what had just happened settling into something real, something lasting. And then, without looking back, he placed his hand on the latch, the metal cool against his palm, and for the first time since anyone in Red Hollow could remember, the man they had already dismissed stood on his own, ready to open a door they had all believed would never move again. The latch did not move at first, not because it was stuck, but because Elias paused, his hand resting against the cool metal as if he needed to feel the moment settle into something real before it could continue. His breathing slowed, steady now, no longer fighting the effort. Clara remained where she was, a few feet behind him, her presence quiet, grounded. She did not step forward, did not speak, because this was not her door to open. Outside, the gathered townsfolk stood in a silence that felt unfamiliar. No one laughed now, no one whispered. Even the wind seemed to wait, brushing lightly against coats and hats without sound. Elias tightened his grip slightly, not out of strain, but out of decision. And then the latch shifted, a soft metallic click that carried farther than any shout. The door eased open inch by inch, sunlight spilling across the cabin floor, stretching toward his boots, touching the metal braces with a faint glint. He stepped forward, not quickly, not with certainty, but with purpose, crossing the threshold that had once felt impossible. The light met him fully now, outlining his frame, revealing to those outside what they had refused to believe. One man lowered his gaze. Another took a slow step back, as if the truth required space. Clara watched from within, her expression unchanged, not proud, not surprised, simply steady, as if she had always known this moment would come. Elias stood there in the doorway, not leaning, not supported, just standing, the dust beneath his boots shifting slightly with his weight. Real, undeniable. The silence outside deepened, heavier than any laughter that had come before, because now there was nothing left to hide behind. No excuse, no dismissal, just the clear presence of something they had all decided could not happen. And yet there it was, right in front of them. Elias took another step forward into the open air, the sunlight catching his face, revealing something new in his eyes. Not strength, not yet, but direction. And as he moved, slowly, deliberately, the town that had once turned away found itself unable to look anywhere else. No one moved at first, not even the men who had come closest to the door, because what stood before them did not fit into anything they understood. Elias Boone, the man they had stepped around for years, now stood in the open light, not carried, not dragged, not hidden, just there, steady in a way that made the air feel different, heavier, clearer. One of the older men shifted his weight, boots scraping softly against the dirt, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak. But no words came, because there was nothing he could say that would make sense of what he was seeing. Elias took another step, slower now, not because he could not move, but because he no longer needed to rush. Each motion deliberate, each shift of weight something he felt and understood. The braces moved with him, not forcing, not pulling, but guiding, responding like they had been waiting for this exact rhythm. The sunlight stretched across the ground ahead of him, warm, steady, and he followed it without looking back. Behind him, inside the cabin, Clara remained where she was, her figure framed by the doorway, still and quiet, as if she had already stepped out of the moment and left it entirely to him. The townsfolk watched her for a second, then back to Elias, uncertain where to place their attention, uncertain who had changed more. A young boy near the edge of the group took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide, not with disbelief, but with something closer to recognition, as if he had not yet learned to doubt what he saw. The others noticed him, then glanced at each other, something shifting between them, not loud, not spoken, but present, the kind of shift that happens when certainty begins to loosen. Elias reached the worn path leading away from the cabin, his boots pressing into the dust, leaving marks that had not been there before, marks that did not fade immediately, and for a moment, that was all anyone could focus on. The simple fact that he was leaving something behind with each step, proof that did not argue, did not explain, just remained. One of the men removed his hat fully now, holding it in both hands without realizing it. His gaze lowered, not in shame exactly, but in the quiet understanding that something had been missed, something important. Elias paused once more, not because he had to, but because he chose to, his head turning slightly, not fully back, just enough to acknowledge the space he had come from. The door, the cabin, the figure still standing within it. Clara did not nod, did not smile. She simply met his glance with the same steady calm she had carried from the beginning. And that was enough. Elias turned forward again, the path ahead no longer uncertain, just open. And as he continued, step by step, the town of Red Hollow stood in silence. Not because they were told to, not because they were afraid, but because for the first time, they were watching something they could not reduce, something that asked nothing from them except to see it clearly, and that alone was more than most of them were ready for. The sound of his steps carried farther than it should have, each one pressing into the dust with a quiet certainty that settled over the crowd like a weight no one could lift. Elias did not hurry, did not look for approval. He simply moved forward along the narrow path that led away from the cabin, the braces at his legs catching the sunlight with each motion, not hiding what they were, not pretending, just there, honest and visible. The townsfolk parted without being told. A slow shifting of boots and shoulders, creating space where none had been offered before. A man near the front cleared his throat as if to speak, but the words did not come, because nothing he could say would fit what stood before him. A woman lowered her gaze, her hands tightening around the edge of her shawl, remembering something she could not name, something she had once dismissed too quickly. The young boy stepped closer again, following the line of footprints Elias left behind, placing his own boots carefully beside them, not mocking, not testing, just tracing, as if trying to understand how something like this could exist. Elias continued, each step finding the ground with more certainty than the last, not perfect, not without effort, but real, his breathing steady, his shoulders no longer carrying the same weight they had inside the cabin. Behind him, Clara remained in the doorway, the light framing her silhouette, her presence quiet, almost distant now, as if she had already stepped out of the story she had started. The wind moved through the street, lifting dust in slow spirals around the gathered figures, carrying with it the faint creak of leather and the soft whisper of fabric, sounds that had always been there but now seemed sharper, clearer, as if the world itself had shifted its attention. One of the older men finally removed his hat fully, holding it at his side, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect, though he did not yet understand why. Elias reached the edge of the main road, where the packed dirt stretched wider, open, leading beyond the town. He paused there, not because he had to, but because the moment called for it. His head lifting slightly, his eyes scanning the horizon, not searching, just seeing. The distance no longer felt like something that would swallow him whole. It felt like something he could meet, step by step. Behind him, the town stood still, caught between what they had believed and what now stood undeniable before them. And in that silence, heavier than any judgment they had ever spoken, the truth settled in slowly, not as a miracle, not as something distant and untouchable, but as something far simpler, something they had all walked past without ever stopping long enough to see. And as Elias took another step forward onto the open road, the space behind him remained quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one there yet knew how to say it. The road did not change for him. It remained the same stretch of packed dirt it had always been, the same path that had carried wagons, boots, and silence for years. But something in the way Elias walked it made it feel different. As if the ground itself had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal what it could hold. His steps were still measured, still careful, but no longer uncertain. Each one placed with intention, each one followed through, the braces at his legs no longer foreign, no longer separate, but part of a rhythm he was beginning to understand. Behind him, the town did not disperse, no one turned away, because leaving now would mean denying what they had already seen, and that was something none of them could manage. Not anymore. The older man who had removed his hat earlier stepped forward slightly, his boots pressing into the dust, his posture no longer rigid, no longer certain of itself. He opened his mouth again, searching for something to say, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a question, but the words stayed just out of reach, because what stood before him did not ask for either. Elias paused again, not far from where the road widened, his shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm, his breath no longer strained, just present, real. He looked down briefly at the marks his boots had left behind, the line of them stretching back toward the cabin, toward the place where everything had shifted. And for a moment, his expression softened, not with pride, not with disbelief, but with recognition, as if he was seeing his own story for the first time, outside of what others had decided it was. The young boy moved closer again, his small steps quiet, respectful, stopping a few feet behind Elias, not crossing the distance, just standing there, watching, learning something he would not forget. The others noticed him again, the way he looked without judgment, without doubt, and something in that simple act unsettled them more than anything else had, because it showed them what they had lost. Clara remained at the cabin door, her figure still framed by the light. But now she stepped forward just once, enough to leave the shadow behind, her boots touching the edge of the path. She did not call out, did not draw attention to herself, but her presence shifted the balance of the moment, not as the center, but as the origin. Elias felt it without turning, the quiet confirmation that he had not done this alone, but that he was the one carrying it forward now. He lifted his head slightly, his gaze moving beyond the town, beyond the watching eyes, towards something that did not need to be named. The horizon stretched out ahead, wide and open, and for the first time in years, it did not feel distant. It felt reachable. The wind moved again, slower now, brushing past him, past the gathered figures, carrying with it the faint sound of his own steps echoing back from the space he had crossed. And in that sound, in that simple, undeniable rhythm, the truth settled deeper into the town of Red Hollow, not as a spectacle, not as something to talk about, but as something they would carry quietly, whether they wanted to or not, because once seen, it could not be unseen, and once understood, even in silence, it would begin to change them in ways they were not yet ready to admit. No one told him to stop, and no one told him to continue, because for the first time, the town understood that this was not something they could direct. Elias stood there on the edge of everything they had ever believed about him, the road stretching forward, the silence behind him heavier than any words. His chest rose slowly, the breath settling deeper now, not from effort alone, but from something steadier taking hold. He looked down once more, not out of doubt, but to see the marks his steps had made, the line of them clear in the dust, unbroken, real, and in that simple trail, there was something undeniable, something that did not ask for approval or explanation. It just remained, The older man finally lowered his gaze fully, his hat still in his hands, his posture no longer holding the same certainty it once had. A woman near the back shifted slightly, her hand moving to her chest, as if something inside her had just been recognized, something she had not allowed herself to feel before. The young boy stepped closer again, stopping just a few feet from Elias now, his eyes not wide anymore, but steady, as if what he saw had already settled into something normal, something possible. And that quiet acceptance carried farther than any disbelief the others still held. Clara took another step from the cabin, the door behind her left open, not as a statement, not as an invitation, but as something unfinished, something that did not need to be closed yet. Her gaze rested on Elias, not measuring, not questioning, simply acknowledging, as if the moment belonged to him now and always had. Elias lifted his head again, his eyes moving past the faces, past the town, toward the open land that did not judge, that did not remember him as anything less than what he chose to become. Next, his shoulders settled into a new kind of stillness, not the stillness of being stuck, but the stillness of being grounded. He took another step, then another, each one carrying less hesitation than the last, not because the past had disappeared,